Okay, here we go with another live edition of Jungle Jargon. And there we are here. I want to review a video that Dennis Noble put out or had somehow. And it's kind of interesting the way that he sees so much intent and purpose, but he's denying agency. Somehow he thinks that agency can self-generate from physical things, but he doesn't know how it does it. He just thinks it does, I guess. A lot of creationists uses material to show, how there's so much evidence of creation, except he doesn't believe in creation. He's still looking for a naturalistic cause. So let's get into the video a little bit. Let's go ahead and go to the video. So here we go. Denis Noble. Oh, hello. Hold on a second. Iron Matt. Morning. Okay, let's look at this video of Denis Noble. How he seems to be so close and yet he's so far away. Hold on, let me see if I'm correct here. Oops, I'm in the corner. Yeah, okay. All right. So I didn't finish watching the whole video, but it's such a long video. I'm sure everybody can watch it. I'm not going to get through the whole video for sure. I'm not going to be able to get through the whole video. But let's just go ahead and rewind him back to the beginning. And we'll start. Okay.
Something has to speed evolution up. And that's what Darwin realized. There has to be other processes that short circuit the extremely slow process of random change in the genome.
The mathematics of it all tells us that something needs to influence it to move faster.
It's that otherwise it would take far too long.
Right. So this is the problem. He needs lots and lots of time, and there's just not enough time for evolution to happen. Everybody knows this. Everybody understands this who knows anything about evolution. But let's listen to some of the details that he goes through as far as what's required for life to exist.
This is Leiden, the Netherlands, where I attended a lecture by Professor Denis Noble, who argues that biology has to break free from dogmatic thinking.
A dogma? In science? Come on! But it's not a joke! It's one of the most important errors ever made in science.
Noble is known for his cheerful yet fierce attack on the central dogma in biology, the idea that organisms are fully covered by genes, which got popularized by Richard Dawkins.
Right. So this is a reoccurring theme here, is that we are what our genes dictate, is what they thought, but it's becoming very clear that that's not the case, is that the genes don't determine your destiny. It's what you will to do that determines your destiny. And that's the whole thing about agency, is that you can't get agency from physical things. And yet over and over again, Denis Noble is trying to get agency from physical things.
Ordinary book, The Selfish Gene. It's a fabulous story. It's just completely different from what actually happens in biology.
Right. So Richard Dawkins, everything that Richard Dawkins says is just basically just rubbish, you know. And so he's had several debates with Richard Dawkins, and not to put him down, Richard Dawkins is my distant cousin, but I just think he needs to reevaluate a lot of what he thinks.
Celebrate the completion of the first survey of the entire human genome.
We were led to believe in 1999, when the whole thing was about to be announced as the first sequencing of the human genome, within 10 years we'd be able to cure your cancer. Has not happened.
This is the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind.
It's an
Right, so they thought that the genome would determine everything. It turns out, at least as far as they can tell, they can't tell where the information is coming from for a living cell to start, living and breathing.
assumption that everything flows according to DNA self-replicating. That simplistic analysis has failed to explain what we need to explain. Where does the instruction come from that the heart receives to do its beating? There's none.
Noble developed the first mathematically based model of cardiac cells. And one of his key insights was that there is no master clock or oscillator to be found in our genome.
Well, he's not found anything in the genome to get the start the heartbeat, the heart start pumping or start beating, or even before the heart, there's an undulating wave that circulates oxygen, because oxygen needs to be circulated throughout the system.
Instead, there seems to be agency on a cellular level to account for our heartbeat.
Purposiveness, agency as we would like to call it today, is central to understanding any living system.
And there's a lot more information than what's in the DNA. They've come to realize there's a lot of information in the structure of the sugars and everything. And of course, that comes about by DNA as well, but it's a very, very complicated thing as to where all this information, instruction comes from, and intent and purpose.
The body as a whole can tell the genome what to do. So what I'm saying is that both replication is dependent on the living cell, and the function of the proteins is dependent on the living cell. Neither automatically follow from the DNA alone.
Instead of viewing evolution as a blind, meaningless, and bottom-up mechanism of nature, Noble argues for biological relativity.
Oh, that's it. Yes, exactly. I formulated that as a principle of biological relativity.
Okay, here's where he denies the input of agency. He said agency is needed, except it's somehow not needed because of his theory of relativity. And even though agency is required, he continues to deny the agency that's required. It's just like continual denial.
Two-way causation.
We have such a strong tendency on we want to plot agency somewhere.
Exactly.
And your image makes that difficult, right?
Because it's impossible. There's
it's
nowhere.
Everywhere and it's nowhere. Is that
it's
a way?
Everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah.
This is the yin and yang.
What kind of response is that? Agency is everywhere and it's nowhere. See, agency is everywhere, and he denies it everywhere that he sees agency. It's obvious that there's agency, and he denies it every time he sees it.
And that the essence of us is out there.
A very warm welcome to the Essentia Foundation's YouTube channel. I have the honor of sitting down in.
It might seem like he's almost a creationist, but he's a very, very deep-seated naturalist. He believes that the agency is a something that arises from naturalism.
The Leiden with Professor Dennis Noble. A very warm welcome.
Great pleasure to come and talk about whatever you want me to talk about.
That's amazing. I just heard you present here at a conference about biosemiotics. We will touch upon that.
Yes.
But maybe good for our audience, for people who do not know you, you're a pioneering physiologist and emeritus professor at Oxford. And in the 1960s, you built the first computational model of a living heart cell. And you've spent basically a lifetime showing how organisms aren't just driven by genes, but by dynamic networks across different scales. And in your latest book,
Okay, it's not built by the genes, but it's built by what? By something something. And later on, he gets into talking about souls or spirits, or maybe not spirits, but souls, and because that's what the original scientists believed in, was the soul and the spirit, because you have to have agency, you have to have autonomy in some way. Oops.
book that you wrote with your brother Raymond Noble, Living Systems, that I really enjoyed reading, you summarize all your arguments against the popular reductionist idea of the
Yes.
selfish gene. So nice to touch upon all of that. And good to know that our audience watching is interested in philosophy and metaphysics, but I think your work in a brilliant way will bring us to those topics.
I
via
think it will.
discussing.
Yes, I understand where you're going.
Yes. Maybe good to start with the beginning of life. How does our life really start? What causes our very first heartbeat?
The first heartbeat in an animal as complicated as us occurs after about 28 days of an embryo. The embryo at that time is no more than perhaps a third of a centimeter in size, embedded in the mother's womb. It has to start that early because oxygen, CO2 can diffuse over relatively tiny distances, a few microns. So as soon as the multicellular organism has become that size at which it becomes impossible for oxygen to diffuse to the center, CO2 to diffuse out, without a circulation, that's when the heart is needed. Now, at that time, the embryo is nothing more than a ball of cells. That's remarkable. A tube forms, which pumps peristaltic.
Here you go. Tube forms. Well, that's genetic, but how it starts undulating, how it starts pumping, it seems to be a mystery, at least as far as he knows, as far as the biologists and people who study this can tell. But the information has to come from somewhere. The direction and purpose has to come from somewhere.
Peristaltically is the word we use, but it means the tube itself has a wave of contraction, forcing the fluid around that tiny ball of cells. But at that time, there is no nervous system. And that's important because each of our muscles in our body, like our arms, legs, head, and so on, is moved by instructions from the nervous system to do what I'm now doing.
Right. And there's no nervous system, no nothing, but yet it's still like undulates. So the question is how all of this happens. So he's going to try to get into it, and well, he's pretty honest as to what he knows, what he can explain, and what he can't explain.
where does the instruction come from that the heart receives to do its beating? There's none. And
Now he says he says there's none. There's none that he knows of, and yet it's doing it obviously when it's needed. Everything happens as it's needed or when it's needed for the living organism to exist. So the command, the instruction is coming from somewhere, but somehow he just still wants to attribute it to chemical reactions or natural causes.
I was faced in 1958 when I started graduate study at University College London with that extraordinary fact. Nobody knew how it could be that a muscle could excite itself to be rhythmic. Now,
That's a good point. How can a muscle excite itself? How can a muscle do what it needs to do when it needs to do it? This is all showing a requirement for intent and purpose.
nowadays, we talk about autocatalytic reactions. It's a long word, but it just means that something self-propels itself. But
Right, but that's just the point. It's not possible for something to self-propel itself, or at least with intent or purpose, or according to what's needed.
we didn't have that idea way back in 1958. So they stopped me with one absolutely fundamental question. They looked at my equations and they said, where, Mr. Noble, in your equations is the oscillator? You see, their mindset was, if he's going to produce this, there must be something that forces the system to do this. Whereas actually the question was, nothing does. So
Right, right. It's not nothing does because something is causing it to happen. So you can't say nothing causes it to happen. Just because you don't know the origin of the instruction doesn't mean there's no instructions. But because obviously the instructions are coming from somewhere.
how does it happen? How could a system excite itself? And they were not really persuaded, but they did say, okay, you've convinced us you've got a problem. We don't know how you're going to solve it, but we will give you some time on the computer. And, well, it worked. I got a paper in Nature, one of the top science journals, showing that indeed it self-excites.
With existing information, which it didn't write itself.
There is, in a biological system, always the possibility that it might generate an automatic cycling process. In another sense, what I was showing...
And if there is such a thing, it's by design anyway, because everything is, of course, is by design, because nothing can cause itself to exist.
Was a fundamental process that must have been operating at the very origin of life. The ability to self-excite and to continue doing so indefinitely.
Yeah, and this is there's a lot in here for people who are new to these terms, self-excitation. Already the word self, it implies...
Yeah, it's like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not possible. And they're still trying to insist that it's possible.
Is that there's some form of agency, which when I
Yes,
say
indeed.
that, of course, is already a bit sinful, I think, in evolutionary biology to
Well, you were
imply that.
not allowed to think that way
Yeah.
in 1958.
You call that also in your book, or it's known as the teleological
Yes,
sin. Maybe if you
indeed
could...
it is. That's right. You were not allowed to think like that. I was taught as a student by people at University College London who were very much part of the reductionist, as we call it, strategy in biology, because just previously 2 years before, Francis Crick had formulated what he called the central dogma of molecular biology, which is a very simple idea that from a sequence in our genes, you can generate a protein. The protein then forms a structure which is determined by the sequence. And finally, that produces the function of the body. So everything could be predicted from what happens at the level of DNA. That is impossible. I've come to realize that after another 40 years of work, before I actually retired from my position at Oxford University and became what's called an emeritus professor. But that was my freedom. I could at last ask myself the audacious question, was that really true? Francis Crick is one of the greatest molecular biologists ever, together with Jim Watson and Wilkins in London, and we have to remember also Rosalind Franklin, who actually did the experiment to get that X-ray picture of DNA as a double helix.
Yeah.
So that's assuming you know everything in a genome. That's assuming you understand the language of the genome, which is forward, backwards, overlapping on both sides. It's assuming you understand everything that's in the code and you read the entire code, understanding it fully, and you're saying that there's no instruction for this and that and the other thing, which is absurd.
And to show that that's exactly what it is. And that was brilliant. And I don't challenge any of that. I think all of that was brilliant molecular level discovery. But he then went on to formulate it as a dogma. He called it the central dogma of biology.
Which is that we can relate everything back to genes, everything back to DNA, that codes
Exactly
everything.
so. You need nothing more than that. Now,
well, it all started when Adam was created and God breathed into him life. Now, this life of Adam continues in each and every one of us when we are born. We have the same breath that God breathed into Adam. We have the same spirit that God breathed into us. And of course, our spirit isn't fixed. Our spirit can respond in different ways. And according to depending on our environment and depending on our understanding, we react accordingly. And that's who we are, basically. You know, each and every one of us has a spirit to determine, to be the agency of ourselves, but we live inside of a biological machine.
Which is what Schrödinger had predicted, right? Schrödinger.
It was actually Schrödinger who formulated that idea way back in 1942 when he wrote a book called What is Life?
Yeah.
And as a physicist, he was, after all, one of the formulators of the wave equation in quantum mechanics. He realized that the only thing that we knew in those days that could replicate itself was a crystal. Students in school.
Now, before they get very far with this crystal notion, there's no written instructions in a crystal. It's strictly structural, and it forms according to its structure components, or its own structure. A crystal has no information. It just builds itself according to its properties that it was given.
Often take a saturated salt solution, let it evaporate slowly, and you watch the crystals forming at the bottom of the solution. It's fascinating.
Yes,
and
it looks like magic. Yeah.
It looks like magic. You know,
Yeah.
the crystals, lovely. The children love crystals anyway. Caves and goblins and goodness knows what. Yes. So
Yeah, it's interesting he said goblins, because a lot of people associate crystals with magical powers, which they don't have. And that's the whole problem with naturalism, is that it ascribes capabilities to physical things that they don't have. That's idolatry.
it's all, to us as children, very exciting to see that. But what Schrödinger said in his book, well, maybe life does that. It just replicates like a crystal. And that has continued all the way down the 70 years or so since as a kind of dogma, reinforced by what Crick did in his central dogma, but made into a popularization by Richard Dawkins and his extraordinary book, The Selfish Gene. It's a fabulous story. It's just completely different from what actually happens in biology.
You're now even being.
Yeah, poor Richard Dawkins gets hammered by everybody. He gets it from all sides. Gets it from atheists, hammer, everybody. He gets it from all sides.
Polite.
Well, I've spent the last 20 years of my work working out precisely what I've just said is true.
Yeah.
First of all, the idea that something replicates itself. True, crystals do that. You don't need to tell a crystal to do it. As soon as the amount of water has evaporated off that makes it impossible to hold those molecules in solution, they will enter into the right place within the crystal. That happens, and of course it's automatic. And when you think of the genetic material, DNA, it is a little bit like a crystal in the sense that each of our nucleotides will attract its pair. They're linked together, A, T, C, G.
Okay, now what he's going to explain here is very, very interesting in biological terms, because he's going to explain how the A, C, T, and G fit together, but not always, and not enough, or not in every case, not enough. So you're going to see agency here coming into play, where for the times that they don't come together like they're supposed to, that there's an enzyme, a foreseen need for an enzyme to put them in the right order, the way they're supposed to be.
In pairs. And they like to be together. That's a chemical fact. We use the word like, but it doesn't mean quite what we're saying when we like somebody. But it is a bit like, because they pair together. Okay, that's pure chemistry. And about a dozen years ago, chemists actually checked. If you unravel the DNA in a dish without a cell, how does it replicate? And it does. And the titles of their papers are interesting. One of them refers to the efficiency of self-replication chemically, and the other with a very similar title for RNA. One did DNA, the other RNA. And they measured the accuracy, and that's the key. It's about one error in something like 10,000 pairs of these C, Gs, As, and Ts.
Yeah. Which sounds pretty accurate to me.
It's pretty good, and that's why the title of the paper is Efficient Replication.
Yeah.
The problem is that our genomes are 3 billion base pairs long. Divide by 10,000, you'll have 300,000 errors, approximately. Any cell that reproduced with that degree of error would not live. It would be, in effect, fated to die.
So here we have the evidence of creation. I mean, if you can't see it by now, is that it's impossible for the A, C, T's, A, and G's to fit together. The amino acids, it's impossible for the amino acids to fit together as enough times, not even considering the fact that they have to be in the right order. Forget information. He's not even talking about the information. He's talking about how they fit together. Even how they fit together is not enough for them to continue to fit together and to reproduce. So it's not even possible without the foresight of an enzyme to make those corrections to have them fit together like they're supposed to.
And of course, the rest of the population of cells would use the energy and the components. So it can't be how it's done. But what actually happens would have utterly surprised Schrödinger, who formulated this idea in the first place. What actually happens is that under the guidance of a living cell, around 7 enzymes.
I had to keep people interrupted, but it's under the guidance of the living cell, which only exists because of the information that made it, and the genome that made it and structured it. So the very structure of the cell, the very, enzymes that it produces and everything is from the information that's pre-existing. Every living organism is made by a pre-existing written program, a written word.
These are proteins that cause a reaction to occur. In this case, the reactions are to cut the DNA and to paste a new nucleotide in. So they're called cut and paste enzymes. And they literally creep along this extraordinarily long thread, which is the DNA, locate where the errors are, take out the nucleotide that's wrong, and put the right one in. It's utterly extraordinary.
And it's because of the forethought and agency to make the enzyme to be able to do that, to structure the enzyme to do that. We're talking about molecular machinery. This is atomic level machinery that works very, very extremely efficiently.
Even more extraordinary, the living cell does not allow itself to divide and distribute the DNA to the 2 daughter cells until that has happened.
How does it know that?
Well, I don't think we know yet.
We don't know.
How does it happen? How does it know that? That's the question, but they keep denying the requirement for agency.
How do those enzymes know when they encounter an error?
No, they can. That we do know. You see, you're back to the double helix formation.
Yeah.
You can check what is in the other thread. That's now unraveled, but it's still there.
Okay.
So you get the information that there's an error from that, and then that you've got to replace that nucleotide.
But the moment the cell knows there are no errors anymore, we can now divide. How does the cell know that moment?
That's the bit we don't know. See, I don't think anybody at the moment, I'm not an immunologist, so may not be able to know everything, but let's make a guess. Somehow, the cell as a whole has got to be ready to start the division process. That's when the membranes actually fold in on each other and two cells appear. And the DNA has also got to be separated, sometimes mixed together. If it's sperm and egg, exactly what happens. But I don't think at the molecular level we know exactly how a cell can be said to know the time has come to divide. But it won't do so until that is the case. If it does do so, the two daughter cells will be fated to die. So they will never be used.
But biochemically speaking, we do not know of a way where it could be coded.
I don't think we do, no. I'm talking from my knowledge.
Yeah.
Whether somebody else already knows that, I don't know that they do. I think they would have won a Nobel Prize if they had found out.
For people watching who are more interested in genes, and I've always been sort of taught this more classical story that most of us think of when we hear about that it is all in our genes. So just to provoke you a little bit, we have Dolly the sheep, a clone from a single cell. We can insert certain...
This is another thing is that they don't understand is that when you clone an animal, it doesn't produce the same animal that was cloned for whatever reason.
I found this this example of a green fluorescent protein from a jellyfish into a mouse that then starts glowing.
Yeah.
There are also these wonderful examples of how it does seem like genes are the code of life, and the cell might be sort of the computer we need to sort of compute it, but the genes, it surely looks like the genes are the code of life, Professor Noble. So
yes,
sorry.
I know. That's what people tell me. You see, and I say, well, wait a minute. If the genome cannot self-replicate, which I've just demonstrated, you're in trouble because you need life in order to make that happen. So already you're in a situation in which a very important function of genes, which is to replicate, to go to the next generation, depends upon the living cell. Think that through, first of all. Second...
Well, the living cell is the result of the genetic information. The structure of the cell is according to the information in the genome. It's the genome, both in the zygote, the information both in the zygote and the DNA that determine what the structure of the cell.
And another problem, which we've not yet discussed, it codes for the protein sequence, the amino acid sequence in the protein. 70% of the proteins formed that way can be folded in many different ways.
This is another problem. How does the cell know, how does the Golgi apparatus know how to fold the proteins? The information has to be by way of instruction and information, because it's only going to be folded the right way if it has the proper instruction.
This has been brought out quite recently. The degree to which protein folding, which is how it works chemically, because that's how it, for example, the protein that grabs a virus formed by the immune system has a particular shape, which is designed, I use that word advisedly because I think it is, it's designed.
Actually, I think there's more than one way of folding. One is the barrel-shaped thing. It goes into a barrel, and the barrel folds it, and then it's refined by the Golgi apparatus. Like there's, I think that's the way it works.
to fit that virus. And that is not determined solely by the genome. Partially by it, because that's how the immune system generates a new grabbing protein that enables that particular virus to be grabbed. That's why it takes us about a week to become naturally immune to, for example, the COVID, during the COVID pandemic. But if you ask the question, are proteins automatically folding according to their structure? The answer is no, they fold according to their environment. You can even show that the same
They fold according to how they are made to fold by the directives, the instructions.
protein can be present in the fluid of the cell and act as a simple enzyme, meaning something that speeds a reaction up. That's necessary for our generating energy. And at the same time, if it happens to find itself within a lipid membrane, one of the membranes of the cells, it can be a transporter. It can be both, either, just depending on the circumstances. Now, why can it do that? One of the great successes of the Human Genome Project, when it was first announced in 2001 with a big paper in Nature, there's a figure in that paper which shows the evolution according to the species in which they were investigating, of the way in which proteins have generated additional functions by adding a new functional bit of amino acid sequence to their structure. That's gone on over the billions of years of evolution. Proteins have evolved.
Okay, the proteins, I mean, they can only exist and fold and form according to their instructions. I mean, if there's an accident that folds another way and instructions aren't there to do it, then it's not going to perpetuate. It has to be the information that is altered in some way to do it. And we know that mistakes don't write programming. They only alter the existing program, which is more often detrimental than not. And ultimately, for one step forward, by making mistakes, you take 10 steps backwards or more, 100 steps backwards.
Evolved to have multiple functions, but which they serve is dependent on the living cell. So what I'm saying is that both replication is dependent on the living cell and the function of the proteins is dependent on the living cell. Neither automatically follow from the DNA alone. So I'm very happy to have that question and be told that surely it's just automatic, that the genome specifies. I now lecture worldwide on genes are not the blueprint for life. I was asked, in fact, to write an article for Nature last year, 2024.
In a sense, that's partially true. I mean, as far as, the cloning, you can clone an animal. It's not going to be the same animal. It's going to be totally different animal, totally different personality, everything. It won't be the same animal. It might look like the same animal, but it's not going to be the same animal. So there's other factors besides the information that determine, how the organism acts or reacts, especially in humans, according to their spirit. And he's going to even talk about schizophrenia in a little bit as well, or if we get that far.
I think also the point in your conversation, to relate back what you told earlier, that it needs error correction on a cell level. That's, to me, that is pretty convincing. What puzzles me is this question of agency, that the I'm just thinking, okay, so the cell wants something, the cell has purpose, the cell.
Yes.
Would you go along with terms like that, terminology like that?
Yes, I think you have to, because in the end, you have to use terms that mean what we say. In this case, what we are saying is we do not know how the cell generates the intelligence it clearly has, but that it has it is obvious.
Okay, this you need to refine that point by he's ascribing to a cell intelligence, which is absurd, totally absurd. Intelligence can only come from a mind. And he's saying that the cell already has intelligence. No, the intelligence is coming from outside the cell, which is inputted by way of the genetic information, which was pre-existing.
It doesn't divide until it knows that the genome has been accurately replicated.
Until it confirms that it's been accurately replicated, but that's according to the instructions. That's according to written directives. That's according to the pre-existing information instruction.
And the current microbiology, physics even cannot give us a mechanism here.
Not at the detail of the molecular biology, no. But what we can say is that that process clearly exists. So without working out exactly in detail how it happens, we can be certain that it is there. Now, we do get some parts of the pathways. Physiologists now do the following kind of experiment. How can a cell that on a molecular scale is enormous, if I represent a single nucleotide in one of my genes as the size of my fist, and this here in Leiden was the center of it, the nucleus, then the cell surface for that single cell would be over there in Paris.
Quite a distance.
Hundreds of miles and kilometers away. And yet, within seconds, a signal comes from way over there in Paris to the nucleus here in...
Well, if it's an electrical signal, that's easily understood, because it's not the distance between here and Paris or there in Paris, because it's a lot closer. It's the distance of a cell, and that electrical signal can travel that far, and even a tubicle, or what do they call them tubular things, can span that distance very, very fast to transport proteins and stuff.
Leiden, and tells the genome, please do the following. Now, how do we know that? We know that because physiologists are being able to follow what happens when calcium enters another kind of protein channel at its cell surface, way back there in Paris. And underneath the membrane, the calcium rises to a higher concentration. That triggers a biochemical reaction. We don't need to go through the fine molecular details of that. But that puts a messenger on a motor. Believe it or not, there are motors that walk along tubes in a cell. There are tube trains.
I've seen those images. It's crazy. It's literally a motor
in
on these tubes. Yeah,
and they literally walk along.
Yeah, messaging. Yeah.
If somebody had told this to Schrödinger way back in 1940, could he have even... Oh, come on.
Yeah.
No, this is not possible.
Not only that, but we have literal electric batteries and literal spinning motors, trillions of them inside of our cells that make ATP. It's called ATP synthase. You have to have the positive ions, which is electricity, which run the motors. You have an uneven gradient of positive ions on one side, and of course they want to get to the other side. So while they go onto the other side, they spin an electric motor, and they manufacture and produce ATP energy molecules, which is basically like a spring. It compresses like a spring, which takes energy, compresses them together, and those little energy ATP molecules are released as energy, and they become ADP, and then they return back to ATP, and the cycle keeps going on. This is how we can eat a sandwich and run all day on the sandwich.
But it is. When I exercise, I'm telling my muscle cells, please make more protein. How do they do that? They send a message along those tube lines to tell the DNA in the right place in the nucleus to make more myosin, which is a muscle protein, and more actin, which is another muscle protein. That's how they do it.
And so that dogma, or what's it called, the whole idea that it's only one chain of causation from genome to RNA to proteins, and then the organism or the organ. You say it works both ways. So these messengers, it has to. Okay.
It has to. That's right. There has to be feedback from the higher level of. Now, wait for it. I'm going to use the word.
It has to, but this has been established, right?
It's been established that is necessarily true. Yes, because that's how the immune system works.
Yeah.
But if you ask the question, do we know the full molecular details? No. We know about those tram lines going all the way from Paris to Leiden, in our metaphor for a moment.
Yeah.
But if you ask the question, what exactly is the structure that is the messenger in that case for, let's say, telling the muscle proteins to make more protein? Well, the muscle gene coding for those proteins to make more of those proteins, well, we'd probably know that the messenger is probably an RNA. That is another kind of nucleotide sequence, possibly existed before DNA. But let's not worry about that technical detail. We can probably guess it'll be one of those. There are many RNAs. The genome, in fact, produces more RNAs than it produces proteins.
Yeah.
That's difficult too. Those should be called genes too, but we don't.
There you go. That's an interesting aspect right there. So that means the genome is sending out signals by way of the RNA messenger RNA. So if the genome is constantly sending out signals for this, that, and the other thing, well, that's probably where a lot of the instruction is coming from the genome.
It's not the way our discoveries occurred. Anyway, however one puts all of that, yes, you can make good guesses as to what would be going down as messengers on that little tubulin going from the cell surface to the nucleus to tell it what to do. But in every single case, we won't know the precise molecular details. That's for people to work out in the future.
Yeah. But your work, what I find astonishing is that, just very nice to see how science operates, that science operates on the questions we permit ourselves, right?
Yes, indeed.
And that, of course, relates back to metaphysics, what our foundation is about. It was the work of Michael Levin, who's been inspired by your work, to think, hey, wait a minute, if it's not all coded in the genome, and interested in bioelectric fields, who has now been able in the lab to show by influencing bioelectric fields, that basically influencing the messenger in Paris, hey, I want this, and what he wants is like a different organ even.
Indeed so, yes.
And which is crazy, right? I'm just curious what your thoughts here on his work, how it relates to your thinking.
Well, first of all, it's absolutely phenomenal what he's shown. You can take cells from the skin of a frog, isolate them from their environment, which is the frog skin, which is a very complex organ, incidentally. We ought to often think of skin as, well, just what makes us look beautiful, if we are, or handsome if we're not. You hope. But anyway, it's not. It's an extraordinary, sensitive. I'm just doing this at the moment to feel what I'm feeling. Extraordinarily sensitive structure to heat, sound, that's the way our ears work. All the various receptor processes occur at the surface. And cell surfaces, too, have got ways of detecting what is happening. And so they're able to detect, for example, in Michael Levin's work, we're no longer connected. There's just a little bunch of us, maybe 5 cells. But we've got to feed. What do they start doing? They start using their little wavy cilia on the surface of the cell to swim in the environment to see whether they can find food. Wow. They're already an organism.
Wow. Together.
Yeah, well, they're just part of an organism doing what they're made to do, what they're supposed to be doing, what they're directed to do. And they'll do it as long as they can continue to exist.
Together. Now, that brings me to cancer. So I think one of the big implications of Mike Levin's work is the insight cancer is an organism within the organism. It's a group of cells that have done what his xenobots, as he calls them, his frog skin robots are doing. It looks for its own way of surviving. And actually, the more we invade it with radiation or with chemotherapy, the more it will find ways of escaping all of that, which is why we managed to push cancer back for a few years, but very often, not always, thank goodness, but very often it just starts to come back again. And the reason for that is exactly what happens in those xenobots of Mike Levin. They start radiating their way of changing their genes to look for ways of surviving even better. That's what a cancer does. That's why it's so difficult to control.
Yeah, but it doesn't he sort of, his work point to a paradigm shift in treating cancer, namely that we can tell those cells to stop by influencing bioelectric fields?
If we can, that's what the immune system tries to do, of course. The immune system has a huge role to play. And my concept of cancer is that there are potentially cancerous cells all the time. Because come back to that cell division, occasionally it does go wrong. And it starts to divide before the accurate replication has been completed. When that happens, you get a defective cell. Often that will just die of its own accord, but sometimes it will survive. That will be happening all the time. In the sense that a cancer is a rogue cell, rogue cells exist all the time in our bodies. But what does it normally experience? The immune system comes and kills it. Now you've got a problem. How does it know what to kill and what not to kill? If it's ramped up too much, you get autoimmune disease. There's a fine balance between giving the immune system too much power, in which case it will kill the body itself, and giving it enough power to detect all of those defective cells.
Right, so it has to identify which is a good cell and which is not a good cell. And as long as it's able to do that, we're fine. But when it's not able to do that, that's when we have problems. You know, like if it misidentifies a good cell as a bad cell, then there's a real problem.
And kill them. That's very characteristic of living systems, that they have to make those very difficult decisions, a balance of what degree of power do you give?
Yeah, philosophically, it really interests me that when talking about Michael Levin, thinking about his work, I also at a moment thought cells have to forget themselves in a sense, right? They function in sort of in favor of the whole organism.
Yes.
And a cancer cell stops doing that.
Indeed, that's right. It no longer is part of the organism.
Yeah.
And we know how cells communicate to tell themselves that they're part of the same tissue. These are called the microsomes, or the exosomes, or the extracellular vesicles. These are tiny packets of cell information. And cells are exchanging these all the time. The curious thing is that idea goes back to Charles Darwin, 1868. He didn't see and couldn't, with the microscopes of the day, the particles that he postulated, but he knew that cells had to communicate to each other because he thought that we could communicate body characteristics to the germ cells, the future egg and sperm. That's a Lamarckian idea. But the point I'm making is that the idea that cells tell each other, I'm part of this tissue, I think they're doing that all the time, and that's what produces the integrity that's normally there. But when it goes wrong, of course, it produces a cancer.
You seem to be wanting to rehabilitate the true Darwin. I mean, I just heard you say in a presentation that you said neo-Darwinism is dead.
Yes.
So here we go. We can see clearly that he's not rejecting Darwinism. He's clearly holding on to his idolatry, his belief in a natural cause for natural things, which is, to me, is totally absurd. To me, I don't see how anybody could believe such a thing.
But the true Darwinism is far from dead. Exactly so.
Tell me about what is true Darwinism?
True Darwinism includes natural selection, which of course is his original great contribution, together with Alfred Russel Wallace. They did that together in 1858.
Of course, this natural selection is selection of mistakes that are supposed to be beneficial and will have all of this foresight that's required for a living organism to not only exist, continuing to exist, but to transform and morph itself while it's existing, which is, requires more abiogenesis of information than abiogenesis itself. So if you corner an AI, the AI will tell you that evolution requires more abiogenesis, is more impossible than abiogenesis itself. It's just totally absurd.
And in 1859, Darwin published his famous book, The Origin of Species. But nearly 10 years later, he knew that there was something missing. Because even in The Origin of Species, he explains that the body communicates change to the future egg and sperm. That's the Lamarckian idea, which is that characteristics developed in us can be transmitted down to future.
With epigenetics, the information is transferred from parent to child. In other words, the experiences of the parent and the environment of the parent will influence the formation of the child, which has nothing to do with what it is.
Generations. Physiologists have found that for at least 20 years now. So we've been in conflict, in a sense, with standard neo-Darwinism for that period of time. Now I come to what Darwin did. He not only thought there may be communication between cells in the body, but he also thought, well, wait a minute, what is that magnificent peacock doing when it opens up its wings and the peahen sees, 40 or 50 eyes staring at it with great translucent fluorescent coloring? He thought, well, it's trying to tell that peahen, I want to mate with you.
The female is influenced by beauty. So the male some way needs to put together stones in an attractive way, or in some way attract the attention of the female by way of beauty, some way.
But then he realized, but wait a minute, that means the peacock intends to do. He writes that. He says in his book in 1871.
Then again, I was watching another video, creationist video, said they cut out all the eyes and it didn't make any difference. It had nothing to do. That had nothing to do with whether or not there was any selection going on.
The peacock consciously tries to convince the peahen.
But it's not just for the female to see the beauty. It's for us to see the beauty of God's creation.
And then a bit later in the same book, he writes the peahen can do it too. Of course, in a different way. She's not spreading enormous beauty as the male does. It depends. Some species have it that way round. The males carry the beauty and the females don't. In us, it's the other way round.
And people watching will just think, I mean, like just like a surface understanding of evolution that has been just like the trial and error of nature ending up with a beautiful
Exactly
pattern.
so. Well, if you give evolution as natural selection enough time, but that may be 30 billion years, longer than the existence of the universe. Something has to speeded evolution up.
So this is continually the problem with evolution, is that there's not enough change going on of any kind to account for any amount of evolution. So he's trying to get evolution to speed up. Now we know as creations that variation happens very, very quickly, especially right after the flood. Variation happened very quickly, everything isolated into their individual groups and individual environments, and they specialized to those environments and resulted in very different looking animals, even though we know they're the same. They came from the same original animal. So we can account for the variation as creationists because it's a part of the genome. But once everything is isolated and separated into their environments, they're not going to come back and be what they were originally because they've specialized too much. They've lost a lot of the original information that they had. And theoretically, the only way to get that is to get all the information from all of them and put them back together and make it an original animal, which is not possible, obviously, but that would be the only way to return to the same original animal. But that's not, his mistakes are not accounting for all the variation that we see. All the variation that we see is from existing information and the selecting of certain information so they have genetic drift and responses to the environment and adaptation to the environment, and all these mechanisms are part of the existing genome. These are not the result of mistakes. How can I get this into your head? It's not, you're not a mistake. You're not the result of mistakes.
And that's what Darwin realized. There has to be other processes that short circuit the extremely slow process of random change in the genome.
Can we sort of account for that mathematically for this point? The mathematics of it all tell.
Yeah, mathematics totally disproves evolution. So you forget ever trying to prove evolution mathematically. It's totally impossible mathematically speaking.
Tells us that something needs to influence it.
Yes,
to move faster.
It's that otherwise it would take far too long. Let me give an example back to the human genome sequencing in 2001. What that showed was a comparison between human genome and the genome of a yeast cell, that's a single cell organism, fly, worm, through to the mouse, and then human. At that time, 2001, we at last had the genomes of all of those. They did a very simple thing. In figure 42 of that paper, they represented the proteins that arose. Well, they were particular proteins. They're called transcription factors, but don't let's worry about the detail. They took particular types of protein and showed that they had evolved by transferring whole domains of sequence from one gene to another. It's forbidden by the central dogma.
See, this is a thing that he's talking about transferring whole groups of genetic information from one to another. This is something that a bacteria is able to do. A bacteria is able to appropriate any DNA and incorporate it into its own genome. And yet it remains a bacteria the whole time. But if it's useful, it'll incorporate any information from any animal. And we don't see them morphing into any other creature because they have their instructions, they have their directives, and they follow those directives.
Now, that had actually been discovered nearly 100 years ago by a very famous American geneticist called Barbara McClintock. She showed, looking at corn growing in conditions of drought and any other factors that influenced its environment, putting it under stress, that suddenly the corn starts to do exactly that. It juggles its genes. It actually moves genes from one chromosome to another. You could see all of that under a microscope.
Yeah, corn is a good example. Well, plants in general do change a lot, do morph a lot. And it's by way of this, transporting these genetics instructions the way they are able to do, but they still remain the plant that they were ordered to be with all different variations, but it's from existing information, different amounts of existing information, different measures and sizes of the protein's structure. That's how we get all the different varieties from one plant. From the same original organism, you get all these different forms and shapes and sizes.
Watching the chromosomes. She didn't know about DNA in those days. This is way back in the 1930s, 1940s. 1950s is when we got to know about DNA. And she was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1983. And she published a paper saying, this gives a totally different picture of life. The genome is an organ of the cell. What she meant was the cell controls the genome. What was I describing earlier in this discussion? Precisely how it does that. The body as a whole can tell the...
But it cannot change from what its original structure. It can have all this variation, can take on all these different attributes, but it's still going to remain the same original kind that it was ordered to be. Because in order to be something different, you have to change its basic structure, and mistakes aren't going to make that happen.
You know what to do. Now, we don't necessarily do it consciously, but to come back to Darwin, we're now back to the peacock displaying its beautiful feathers for the peahen to appreciate, convince it to mate. He wrote that Peacock was intending to do that. He had the concept of agency. He didn't use the word agency, but what is intention? It's precisely that. I think that a very big mistake has been made since the central dogma was formulated way back in 1956. And that's the idea that purposiveness, agency, as we would like to call it,
because the cell is the result of the genome, and then now he's trying to say the cell is going to dictate what the genome does. That's very circular reasoning. And it's clear to me that things are what they were ordered to be. And there's a lot of variation, adaptation, genetic drift, everything, but they're not going to change it to a different kind of creature.
today is central to understanding any living system. Those xenobots of Mike Levin's have got agency which they have generated from that situation which they suddenly find they're no longer.
They have generated, no, it's existing information gone rogue. That's all it is. Or isolated in that case. But in the case of cancer, it's existing information gone rogue. That's all it is. Nothing other than that.
Part of the frog's skin.
Yeah.
And they create the agency to look around with their cilia, swimming away to try and find food.
Okay, so in the case of a transplant, what would it do? It would join back into the original organism or another organism if it's accepted. That's what it was made to do. If it's isolated, it can be reinstated. That's what we are. I mean, that's how we heal, is that it's all joined back together.
I think, therefore, agency is something that is fundamental to any living system. How do we explain it? Good question. I don't think we have the evidence yet to say.
Yeah, he doesn't have the evidence. Doesn't have enough evidence to see that there's a creator yet. But so he's going to keep on promoting. Either he's sly or he's just naive. He's sly, trying to get people to see that there's agency, but he keeps saying there's no real agency. Agency is generated by the material, the environment that exists. He's refusing to acknowledge an external agency, even though every one of us is a spirit. Every one of us is autonomous.
In detail how that happens.
Yeah.
But that it happens, we can't doubt any more than we can doubt whether the immune system knew, in inverted commas, for the moment anyway, the immune system during the COVID pandemic knew that it had to find new immunoglobulins and told its cells, mutate. Please make new immunoglobulins.
This is the immune system depends on mutations. The immune system generates mutations in order to accommodate or to come up with a cure for the invasion. That's the way the immune system works. It depends on mutations, so it accelerates the mutations in order to find a fit, in order to solve the problem. But that's by design. That's by command, directives.
Immunoglobulins, and then selected out of those, the few that succeeded, asked them to reproduce. How did it know to do that? I don't think we fully know the answer to that yet. But do we?
It's intentional. It's intentional.
Need to know in order to know that it did it? No, we know already. Yeah. Just as I know that you are an agent and I'm an agent and he over there is an agent.
No, because you could easily just have said, "You're a spirit. I'm a spirit. He's a spirit. We're all spirits. We're all agents, independent of matter."
Yeah.
So there's a difference. This gets on to philosophy, doesn't it? Because
Yeah, definitely.
there is a difference between admitting that something exists and that something has been explained.
Yeah.
And it's the purpose of science to try and explain.
Indeed, if you assume that our physical universe, matter, the chemistry of life is all there is, you would need a mechanism. Whereas if you say there might be an immaterial processes or whatever, you do not necessarily have to account for everything in a material way. But
Right. Well, I'm not sure it's quite so simple as that, but it's getting there, yes. There's a difference between knowing that something happens because you see the evidence for it
yeah,
in the intentionality of the peacock, for example, or the whatever it is you're investigating, those xenobots going.
Half the time, I think he's just afraid of not being known and accepted as a scientist if he acknowledges the supernatural, or the what he calls philosophical realm, which is not physical.
Shooting off and trying to live. The difference between that and having explained how exactly it does it, because once you get onto the question of how exactly it does it, you're into the question of levels of organization. Because at what level is all of that integrated? That's what led me to the idea that we have to see systems all the way up and down, all the way up to the body as a whole, and even to the social context in which the body exists, and down to the molecular level. But interestingly, the most constrained level is the molecular level. That's the level at which no choice can be made.
There you go. No choice can be made at the molecular level. But at some point, there is a choice, and the way, from all appearances, is that you have the biological machinery, and then you have the breath of this spirit of God, or the breath of man, God breathing into us, our spirit, and we get our spirit from our parents. We get half of each of their genomes, but we also get a beating heart, and basically we just come into existence as a new individual created person or created spirit.
You can say, in a sense, that a nucleotide chooses to be associated with T rather than G, if it's an A, but in fact is determined chemically. Once you've got the energy of interaction between those nucleotides, there's nothing they can do other than to do what they do.
yeah,
So that is inevitably the most constrained level. As you go up the levels, you get to increasing openness to forms of structure that are open to what the environment is doing. And once you do that, it becomes no longer a matter of chemistry.
Well, if it depends on environment, then you're talking about just blowing whichever way the wind blows. And that is not the case with a spirit. A spirit goes contrary to the way the wind blows. And information goes contrary to the way of chaos or randomness. Information is specific, and it's always showing intent and purpose.
It becomes a matter of the organization at higher levels of organization. I formulated that as a principle of biological relativity. It sounds like a long word, but all the word relativity means, and even in Einstein this is what it means, is two-way causation. Is that nothing
So he thinks everything is a natural causation.
exists in and of its own. It's already always relative to what it can interact with.
Yeah.
Matter doesn't exist without a space that it deforms in general relativity to be the space within which the matter moves in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's two ways all the time. So relativity just means that. It's always a relational situation between two parts of a system.
Yet he's going to acknowledge in a little bit that we are not subject to our genome. We're not dependent on our genome as to what we choose to do, contrary to Dawkins' assertion.
And, well, you can give it all sorts of names. You can say it's special. That's part of Einstein. It's what leads to his ideas about the speed of light movement through the universe. You can say it's general, which is his ideas about the general properties of the universe. And you can say it's biological because it's the structure of the way in which there's organization within biology to do exactly the same thing. The molecular level being constrained by the next level up. Micro things within cells, and then cells constraining those, and then tissues constraining cells, organs constraining the tissues, finally the organism as a whole constraining itself, and then the social level constraining the organism. And so it's all constraints all the way up.
Yeah, I printed out this one from your
Oh, that's
book.
it. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's
In fact, you can no longer arrange it quite right, because it's no longer correct to arrange it as levels like that, up and down. It's better to think of it as radiating circles of interaction.
yeah.
Because I think
So what he's saying is not bottom up. He's denying the bottom up causation that Dawkins is claiming, but he's saying that it's everything is involved, everything is influencing everything to result in our existence in some way by a natural cause.
once you move to the social level, which is the level where you've got to have meaning making, you are outside the standard causation between the levels of physical processes.
Yeah. And of course, the big question in thinking about, we have such a strong tendency on we want to plot agency somewhere.
Exactly.
And your image makes that difficult, right?
It's impossible. There's
it's
nowhere.
everywhere and it's nowhere. Is that
It's
a way?
everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah.
And you know, this is an insight of Oriental philosophy for a long time.
That's a clear contradiction right there. Agency is everywhere and it's nowhere. Well, agency comes from a source outside of the physical realm.
What is the yin and yang? It is actually the same idea that each molecular element interacts with other molecular elements in a two-way interaction.
Yeah, same pagan physical ascribing everything to natural causes, or same form of idolatry is what it is. You know, circular reasoning. Nature produced nature.
The way we detect some of the most invisible particles in the universe, the neutrinos, is to look for the very rare event when a neutrino interacts with another particle. That's how the physicists do it. They build huge underwater caverns of caverns of water in which to watch this happen. It's so rare. There's dark matter postulated to exist. We're getting into metaphysics now. There's dark matter postulated to exist that we...
Dark matter is supposed to be physical. I just calling it metaphysical. Well, it's it's an idea. So in that sense, it's metaphysics in the sense that it doesn't actually exist. It's just a proposed idea.
Can't see. Physicists are already having to at least consider there might be things we can never detect. There might be matter that we can never detect. But that depends upon first having the concept that all that we can detect is always two-way. Because what do we mean by detect it? We mean we can see it. How do we see it? Because our photoreceptors enable us to see something happening that says that exists.
Yeah.
And of course, dark matter won't do that because it doesn't enable our receptors to be excited. But look, there are many things like that. There are wavelengths we can't see.
Yeah.
But many of those wavelengths are seen by a fish.
And a bird, and other things too.
Or by the squid, or the octopus. We can't say with certainty that what we see is all there is. There's a thought.
We're trapped in our own.
But you're still talking about physical things. There's still physical wavelengths and still physical things that can be detected. But dark matter hasn't been detected because it probably doesn't exist in the first place because the rates of causation in the universe aren't the same everywhere.
Our images, our cognition, our models of the world.
Yes.
Hearing you talk, also, I've mentioned it maybe too often on this channel, but I'm just fascinated by the work of John Wheeler, the physicist.
Yes.
That's the image of, relating back to how we started our conversation, that self-excitation.
Yes.
As the universe, as
A little bit off subject, but if time and space is stretched one way, it could contract another way, and vice versa. If it ceases to be stretched one way, then it could expand the other way. A little bit off topic, but that's just part of relativity, actually.
the self-excited circuit.
Indeed. I think that must be true. It seems to me very improbable that it's just in this part of the universe that something quite phenomenal has happened, which is leading to and has led to the existence of you and me and all the rest of humanity and the octopus and the squid and so on and so forth. That seems to me to be exceedingly implausible. But what else has happened elsewhere in the universe is very difficult, of course, to know. We can speculate. But that's where we pass across the boundary to metaphysics rather than physics.
Yeah.
And what my dear friends within the reductionist camp in biology, because I've been friendly with Richard Dawkins for over 50 years now, examined his thesis back in
Is that so?
1966.
Okay.
That's true. Yes, exactly. So when we debated 3 years ago in the big festival in England, organized by the Institute of Art and Ideas, he started the whole debate, or discussion as we called it, with, you know, that man over there, he was my thesis examiner. Absolute hilarity amongst the audience at this idea that these two people on opposite sides of the debate were one, student and examiner. Anyway, that's all true. But to come back to the point, what people like Richard will do, and others also in the camp of thinking that things can be represented extremely simply without any philosophy at all. Science has not to do with philosophy, nothing. That's what Richard says. Now, my reply to that is very simple. If you think that, you won't even know how to distinguish between association between one thing happening and another thing happening, and the causation that enables that to happen. Now, why do I say that? Comes out of my own work on the heart. 30 years after presenting my work for the first time internationally, actually here in Leiden at a big congress in 1962. So we're fast forwarding to 1992. By then, I'd found there are not just 5 protein mechanisms involved in heart rhythm, but at least 55 or maybe 555. They're huge. I mean, these are vast networks of gene products, the proteins, RNAs, and so on. And what we found was that you can knock a key one out that was known by our experiments to contribute 80% of the electric current causing that pacemaker potential to develop and therefore causing the heart rhythm. You can block that and only a 10% change in frequency occurs. What tells you?
See how versatile the genome is. The genome is extremely versatile. It's extremely adaptive, and at the same time extremely vulnerable too. But still, I mean, the information structure itself has many backup of information. So if something is knocked out, the other part takes over. I've seen it over and over again. I tried to find papers that I couldn't find that they actually genetically removed the site of fleas or whatever, or what do you call them, gnats or flies, fruit flies, and within a few generations they regained their eyesight by backup of information. But I can never find that article, probably scrubbed or or gotten rid of or something. But the point is that the genome is extremely versatile and extremely adaptive with a lot of backup information.
There's a difference between association, 10%, and causation, 80%. Now, unfortunately, nearly all the associations in genomics, 90-odd% of them, have been shown to be very small. If you understand what I've just said about the heartbeat, and you extend that to all the other functions in the body, we know why. That is that the body has many ways of making the same function happen. If it didn't, it wouldn't survive. It's robust.
Yeah, it's redundant also, right?
Exactly so. Would we trust flying in aircraft if they didn't have backup systems to get kicked in if the control mechanism has been compromised?
Yeah.
No. And in the end, of course, the pilot is the key backup. But before that, there is backup in the system to ensure that it will continue to fly, land safely, and so on.
Which we have learned through experience and from the genome, from life itself. Much of our design is from life itself. And of course, there's more redundancy and backup in the genome than the aircraft could ever have.
So we're used, actually, in our ordinary living day, every time we fly, every time we drive a car, for that matter, because cars are modern computers now.
Yeah, they are.
So you're no longer struggling to turn this. You're getting help from the system that enables this to occur relatively easily. So that difference between association and causation is absolutely universal across biology. Now I come to the important experiment that was done at University College London 2 years ago, published in 2023 in the British Medical Journal, Medicine. And what they did was to take all the genomic information being stored in the National Health Service in England in what is called the polygenic repository. Now, that's a long name for what is actually very simple. All your genome sequences are there, and all the diseases you later suffered from are also there, because the life histories.
Yeah, and every disease is a result of a mutation in the genome. Like there's so many disease, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of diseases. Each one of them is a result of a genetic mutation. I mean, not these. I'm not talking about these imagined diseases or. But I mean, as far as known cause and effect items, there's hundreds of them that are the direct result of a mutation in the genome.
Those people, you can't identify them, so nobody is identifiable from all of this, but you can do statistics on it. And that's precisely what the University College London team did. It's quite a large team that did it, led by a man called Hingarani. And what they did was to say, okay, all the association scores are fairly small, but if we add them all together, we get what might possibly be the cause. That's the hypothesis. It's the cause.
Yeah.
Together, they function to create a situation in which somebody at some time has a heart attack or develops a cancer. Both of them.
Yeah, the heart attack and stuff like that, and well, the cancer is a mutation, but that has more to do with environment and a lot of other things, health, nutrition, and everything else, than it does the genome. I mean, the genome is there; it's great. It responds to the environment, but if you keep on giving it a bad environment by way of bad food intake, and you keep on stressing the system with eating, you know, more. We don't have to eat as much as we eat. We could eat like one meal a day. We'd be better off than if we eat 3 meals a day. Especially when you get older, you don't have to eat hardly. Just in fact, you need to fast a lot more. But this is the environment we give our system. We can't stress our system. We can't overload our system with extra weight and all this stuff, extra processing of food, and especially if it's bad food and all kind of stuff.
Possibly fatal. So they pushed those scores into a computation. Do they predict the diseases those people suffered from? Very simple question. And the answer in the conclusion of their paper, the correlation is very weak. In effect, what they were saying is, by the same standards that determine whether we accept, regulatory-wise, a new drug proposed by a pharmaceutical company, accept it or not, that is, does it work without too many side effects, or too many side effects? What you find is that occasionally you predict correctly, but equally there are a number of occasions where you predict the wrong way. From those scores, that's tragic. We were led to believe in 1999, when the whole thing was about to be announced as the first sequencing of the human genome, that within 10 years, that was the prediction by the leaders in the United States of the Human Genome Project, within 10 years we'd be able to cure your cancer. Has not happened. And you see, what my kind of physiology has done is to explain why that's the case. That's why I want to get this across publicly, that there's a big problem here. I think that means that it's going to be necessary to change tack in the way in which biology is conceived and the way in which it is done. And that is going to include accepting the existence of quite a lot of things that the usually reductionist analysis denies even exists. What the biggest textbook of evolutionary biology in the United Kingdom, and in America for that matter, because it's both, Futuma's textbook called just Evolution, omits, which is anything to do with agency. Nothing must be accepted as having a purpose. Well, I don't understand that. I used to understand it about 40, 50 years ago. But in the last 20, 30 years, I've come to the view, no, look, you have to, some stage or another, admit when you've got the wrong metaphysics. And believe me, the central dogma, which is one of the problems in what I'm describing in standard biology, that is a form of metaphysics. It's an assumption that everything flows according to DNA self-replicating and simple selection by does the organism die or not, being the only process by which evolution occurs. And I think we have to come to the conclusion.
See that he gets almost there. He's talking about agency and everything, and then he switched back to evolution. He wants to change evolution, but he doesn't have a solution for to make evolution valid. But he keeps on wanting to find another form of evolution, which does not exist anywhere. There is no mechanism for evolution to exist, because evolution as it is based on mistakes, which cannot possibly account for everything we see. Cannot possibly account for it. So he's wants to find another mechanism for evolution because he just can't accept the agency. Or he's just being, I don't even know, but he keeps on reverting back to evolution, as if he believes in it. It's like some people say they believe in evolution, but they don't really. They say, they believe in a natural cause, but they don't really. Well, you have to, if you want to be on the right side, you have to tell the truth that there's agency and it's not by way of evolution.
That simplistic analysis has failed to explain what we need to explain. Worse still, it's failed to deliver the health care that we thought genomics alone would be able to deliver. That's serious.
And that indeed is very serious.
Well, as far as healthcare, they're always looking for ways to profit from healthcare, or sure, you have to fund the research and everything some way, but when it boils down to a profit motive only, it tends to and does reject all of the other known natural cures that are better than the drugs. In many, many cases, they're actually better than the drugs. And they refuse to accept it or even tell people because of the profit motive, because they're all about making a profit. The love of money is the root of all evil. And that's certainly the case in healthcare.
Also, I'd say on a cultural level, it also has implications on how people live their lives, right?
I think so. For a very good reason, which has been demonstrated too. If you really believe that you can't help it, my genes made me do this, that is actually the defense that somebody once produced in an American court.
Yeah, this is the difference between him and Dawkins, is that Dawkins believes, the genes made me do it, or at least that's what he says he claims. But obviously it's not the case, which we'll get into in a minute, which I'm a case study in this field or whatever.
Yes,
it's according to what science tells us, right?
I pulled the trigger, but I was not responsible.
Yeah.
At that time, people thought they'd identified, believe it or not, genes that cause criminality. There are no such genes.
This is Skinner also, right? Behaviorism.
I'm afraid so. It is all of that. But worse than that, if you ask the question, what motivated the killing of 6 million people during the Second World War? 6 million gypsies, Jews, and other strange, in the view then of the ruling organization, the Nazi organization within Germany. What was the justification for killing them? It was that their genomes were bad.
I just came back from Israel where I visited Yad Vashem. It's recommended for everyone to see. And it's hard, the mind is a terrible thing. And the mind without the Spirit of God, which is basically what AI is, it's everything of man without the Spirit of God, the wisdom, understanding, and no Spirit of God, no Spirit of truth. But, the mind is a terrible thing without the Spirit of God, without the truth of God, without following truth. You have to always follow truth. Truth is the key to life.
There are no criteria that can be usefully used from the genome alone to identify criminality. Just as there are no genes within your gene sequence or mine or anybody else's that will determine whether or not we're going to be schizophrenic.
Yeah, schizophrenia is a phenomenon. It's something that occurs in the mind. They say it's all chemical and everything, but the chemicals are just a response of what the mind produces. The chemical responses are what the mind itself does. And I'm a witness to the fact that you can change what you believe. And a lot of people, even with a lot of people believe that you are what you are. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't change what you believe. But obviously, you can change what you believe because a lot of people have. There's many case studies that you can become a different person than who you were. And I'm such a person is that I'm a different person than who I was, and that I was schizophrenic for 3 years, so 3.5 years, whatever. And the only reason why I'm not now, I don't have symptoms of schizophrenia, is because I changed what I believed. I stopped believing in the hallucinations. I stopped believing in the stuff, even no matter how real it was. I just ignored it as if it wasn't there. And this, in that way, the symptoms lost their power. There's no reason for me to hallucinate when if I'm just going to ignore the hallucination anyways. It's not going to have any effect anyways. It loses its power over you. And that's how I became well again. But unfortunately, a lot of people are not able to do that for whatever reason. I don't know, but there is a genetic factor to schizophrenia. It's not, but it's also environmental. And but it's not totally physical. If it was totally physical, I'd still be schizophrenic. I'd still be hallucinating, having whatever you call it, delusions of grandeur, and thinking that you're the best person, thinking that you're the worst person, and it's a literal torment. It's it's like your mind takes over, and you have no more control over your own mind. And I regained control over my mind just by determining what was true, believing only what's true, stop doing imaginary miracles and whatever, that I thought I was doing for the sake of my sanity, you know, even if it was true, even if I, it was the case of what I was thinking or what I was believing, I just stopped believing it for the sake of my sanity, you know, and that's the only reason why I'm in my right mind today. So it's not entirely physical. It's metaphysics, but it's based on what you believe. Not only that, it's spirits. It's whether or not you listen to lying spirits, and everybody listens to lying spirits all day long. I mean, that's why we are the mess that we're in. Is that everybody listens and believes in lying spirits, but what they have to say all day long. They're whispering in our ear. And even if you're not schizophrenic, everybody believes things that aren't true all day long. That's why everybody does what they do. They do what they do based on what they believe. But in the case of schizophrenia, it's a phenomena that happens to the mind, where the mind just has this spiral, runs, loop, reasoning loop or whatever, just spirals out of control. So that it's their thoughts that control you instead of you controlling your thoughts. But anyway, I'm an example of somebody with free will who changed what I believe, but it was a difficult process, because I had to change all the habits of every thought that I ever had. So every thought that I ever had, I had to reconsider what I believed, and slowly but steadily, I became free of the schizophrenia, the delusions, the hallucinations, everything, and they never came back. Because when I was still in the Army, about 1985, I was still concerned that it would reoccur. But I'm a good case study because I never took any drugs or medication. So I don't have the side effects of the drugs and medication. Never had any side effects from that, which compounds the problem half the time. It might be necessary or essential at one point for some people, but it doesn't solve the problem. It has complications and everything. But anyways, there's not too many people that have recovered 100% from schizophrenia as I have. And I joke around about, my mind and everything, because I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was torment. It was literal torment, 24/7. It was day and night, and you could not get out of it. You cannot get out of it, day or night. You're just tormented constantly. It's a horrible thing. But there's a reason for it. There's a reason for everything. And it's very, very difficult illness for a lot of people. But like he said, it's associated with poverty, not just poverty, but environmental pressures, basically what causes it. And of course, not everybody's susceptible, because probably everybody, not everybody is bothered by their pressure or environment or whatever. But for me, everything was a big deal back in the day. Now I don't worry about anything. I don't care about it. But I do care about the truth, and I do care about helping people, you know, knowing the truth. And the truth, the absolute truth, is that we have a creator and we are dependent on our creator to cover for us and to recreate us from the inside out, because of course we are dying. We're all dying. Everybody in Adam is going to die. And of course we need a solution for that. And there's nobody else that can give us the solution for that other than our creator who created us. And his provision for us, covers for us, you know, perfectly covers for us because he is one of us, and he received the punishment that we would otherwise have, the entire world would otherwise have, everybody since Adam, deserves the same punishment. They weren't punished only because of the provision of God himself, born of the seed of the woman, who took our place and covered for us, making our existence possible. And the most important thing for us is the sending of his Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit is our only link to God. Our only connection to God is the Holy Spirit. Our only hope for salvation is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, you and the Holy Spirit, you have to acknowledge the Holy Spirit. If you reject the Holy Spirit, you're rejecting the only connection you have with God. So it's you and him, that determine your destiny. Or it's actually, if you want to get technical and all the Calvinist thing and stuff, it's you. Your decision is influenced by the truth of God's word, and your decision to listen to God is because you were convinced by the truth of God's word to listen to him. Because everything's by the power of God ultimately anyways, and anything you do is by the power that God gives you. So it's all ultimately by the strength that God supplies. But God is able, and we have to listen to God. It has to be you have to acknowledge his presence. If you don't acknowledge the presence of the Holy Spirit, you don't have salvation.
To take another example, what does explain that kind of problem? Schizophrenia is a very good example, actually, because what we found is that it's much more to do with poverty within communities, which is why it's familial and why it goes down through the generations.
Like this biggest circle in your image,
it's
right?
The biggest circle there in that diagram, exactly. And that is vastly more important than the gene sequence. The correlation, but remember the difference between correlation or association and causation. The association is there. It's in the families. But the reason for that is a social reason. And we have to admit that, I think, now. To tackle that problem, you're going to have to give rise to treatment that recognizes agency. Because I think the person who thinks like a criminal might, I can't help it, it's my...
Yeah, there's another thing with schizophrenia is that if you weren't a criminal before, you're likely not to be a criminal afterwards. But when you're a schizophrenic, you are capable of doing just about anything. But if you don't have a habit of doing something, you're likely not to do it. But you are capable of doing anything, and that's why some schizophrenics are criminal and become extremely criminal, and others do not. Is that basically what you did before, you're going to continue to do, with the exception that, there's nothing stopping you from doing anything. It's, that's part of the condition of being schizophrenic. Um, if it's in you to do something, you'll do it. If not, you might not do it.
Genes has got the wrong mindset to survive in society.
Yeah.
The mindset is, I can lay back because there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
That is the very opposite of what somebody should be trying to do.
Yeah.
The best way of bringing up somebody who feels like that is to encourage them, well, actually, you do have agency. You can. And Richard Dawkins says this too. We can frustrate our selfish genes, he writes. I have to ask myself the question, how does that work? Well, he said so. We can educate our children. Let us educate our children, because we're the only species that can do this. Where does that idea come from? Can you believe it is Descartes? It's the philosopher back there 300 or 400 years ago who said animals are automata. But then he realized, well, Remy, I'm not. So there must be something, the self, that causes me, the soul he used as the word, of course.
There you go. He's talking about basically the spirit, the spirit. We talk about the soul or the spirit, the autonomy, the you inside of you who decides one way or another what to do. And, it's very obvious. There's the physical, and then there's the spiritual.
Soul, the self, whatever, that enables me to control this body, which otherwise would be a mechanical automaton. Of course, he was impressed, as many were amongst educated people at the time, with extraordinary things, constructions that had been made in the gardens of the rich. Effectively, robots had been created from tiny tubes that were making them move in particular ways.
I didn't know that.
The fluidics they were using, early water computers, if you like, causing mechanical toys to behave like robots, even making sounds. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what happened during that period in the mid-1660 area.
I think artists now doing that with, there's a Dutch
Exactly.
artist.
Yes, exactly so.
It's wonderful.
So I think it is actually terribly important, socially, culturally, to let people realize that agency is real. Without that, you can very easily sink into what I would...
So now we get into the definition of things. He just said agency is real. And it's like people are speaking past each other because of the definitions are not the same. So he just said agency is real, which means that spirits are real. And if spirits are real, that's not a physical thing. Like, he can try to attribute it to physics, but it's not attributable to physics. Spirits are not attributable to autonomy. Intent and purpose are not attributable to physics. It's spiritual. And of course, physics can't cause physics anyways. But everything was created to be what it is. Everything does what it does based on what it's made to do.
call an almost depressive view of life.
Yeah.
I can't help it.
Yeah, and what we see now, I guess, if you want to do that within that, still that materialist reductionist framework, you have to close your eyes, because then a doctor would have to say, we cannot account for the placebo effect, because I basically deny the existence of your free will or mind.
Indeed.
But we know from studies that it does work.
It does work, precisely.
Sorry, I cannot give you, but just do it because it's. But the moment you open up
Indeed.
and are scientific about it, you have to sort of question your metaphysics.
Well,
I'd
indeed.
say, yeah.
Yes. Well, any good doctor knows the placebo effect is important.
Yeah. And
Yes.
as you just said, you critique Descartes. Many philosophers do. To what philosopher do you feel more aligned? I think you mentioned Spinoza's thinking, for instance.
Actually, so Spinoza is extraordinary. He was incidentally Jewish in origin and must originally have come from the Spanish environment, Toledo or wherever it was in Spain. He was in Amsterdam eventually, as Benedictus Spinoza. And he entered into correspondence with the early secretary of the Royal Society in England, which is the National Academy of Science.
Yeah.
And he wrote in Latin. I can even reproduce part of it.
Seriously, Doug.
Concipiamus iam si placet vermiculum. Conceive, if you wish, a tiny worm living in the blood, and it will perceive how the individual particles of blood move around within the blood. But it would have no idea what the purpose of the circulation is. It was a beautiful statement of the difficulty of proceeding from one level of organization, the particulate in this case, we didn't know about molecules, but the particulate, to the general form. But that's a distinction that goes way back to Aristotle. He was the first, as far as we know, to distinguish between causation by form, which is the constraint by the boundary conditions of any system, and constraint by the physical interaction, knocking into each other, sliding over each other, or whatever it might be, that molecules take part in. You need both. Without both, you can't even begin to get solutions to any of the equations of life.
And he would say, wouldn't Spinoza say that this cut that Descartes made, to him was a unity, that the whole of nature is an expression of the divine?
Indeed, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, his theology, which has got him expelled from the synagogue in Amsterdam, just down the road from here in Leiden.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Remember, there was a man over there in Amsterdam who thought very deeply about science, philosophy. The two in those days were not thought of to be a separate set of activity. But there he was, excommunicated from his own community and thinking still about what on earth is divine. Just extraordinary. It was a sad fact that the Royal Society never accepted to publish what he sent, because, well, to come to the point there, the then secretary, Henry Oldenburg, who himself was from the Netherlands, incidentally, he was suspicious of Spinoza's theology and couldn't feel that he could take the decision to publish his ethics, which is one of his greatest philosophical achievements. But that's what would have happened had Oldenburg agreed to take Spinoza's work and publish it in, what are they called? The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. That's a scientific journal. It's still called the Philosophical Transaction because nobody in those days distinguished between a philosopher and a scientist.
Yeah, Newton as well, attributed everything to God, and he didn't separate science from philosophy either. So, and you can see that in the title of his book and stuff.
People understood you have to do both.
It's just interesting how this dualism our mind matter divide way of thinking still influences us,
It
right?
does, that's
and
right.
it's so hard for us to conceive of that as being one. I think models like these start helping, that we say we cannot locate it somewhere, it's everywhere and nowhere, as we
that's
said,
right.
your biological relativity,
Yes.
as you call it. But you do write stuff. For instance, in your latest book, there's a sentence where you say, between brackets, the watchmaker may be blind. So you're
Yes.
talking here about the universe as a whole, I suppose. But she, I like this, she feels her way in the process of change.
Now that's a real contradiction there. A blind watchmaker, that's just absurd as well.
And intention does not come from anywhere. It's definitively what living things do.
Yes.
So intention doesn't come from anywhere. It's what living things do. But living things were ordered by a pre-existing set of instructions. Every living thing was ordered to be what it is by a pre-existing written program that it got from its ancestor, its two ancestors, all the way back to its original ancestor, because living organisms can't create themselves. It's like all you have to do is acknowledge that there's a creator, and all of these problems go away. They all go away. Everything is explained by the evidence. It's physics that says that we have a creator.
Could you explain a bit on this sort of metaphysics which you
Yes.
are proposing?
Actually, that's not the first book in which I elaborated this particular metaphysics. That was, in fact, The Music of Life, way back in 2006. And it's worth going back to that because I was trying to ask myself the question, was Crick, back to Francis Crick, I'm afraid, was he correct in thinking that if he took the claustrum out of my brain, the claustrum is a tiny part of the brain, which has the property that it's connected with almost every other part, which is why he chose the claustrum. Have something that connects with everything else, and perhaps there you've got the neurological form of the self, me. So Denis Noble is there. So I thought, wait a minute, if I've got a pot here and I take that bit of my brain out, forget all the technical difficulties in doing this, and I keep the bit of tissue that I've taken out beautifully perfused, is it going to be me? You keep it alive, that is easily done because even slices of brain tissue can be made to continue living. So is it me? Well, first of all, I can't even talk to it. That's a big difficulty. I can't even communicate with it. Now we come to another.
Then you get all these out-of-body experiences and everything that are documented, where obviously, clearly, that the spirit is not even a part of the body, not even close. It's in the body, but it's totally separate from the body. I mean, you can't slice up the spirit. The spirit is spirit, the flesh is flesh. The physical world is the physical world, the spiritual world is the spiritual world. Realm.
Another aspect of the self, which is, it depends upon that communication. We define who we are by interacting with other beings. The little bit of evidence we have on feral children, there aren't many, but of the few authenticated cases one can take, they don't behave like a human.
These are children who grew up amongst,
exactly,
amongst animals or
amongst dogs, whatever it might be, monkeys, that have adopted them.
Yeah.
Very rare that this happens. But what you find is that they don't behave human-like anymore. They have not acquired the cultural environment in which we as babies grow up within our families. And I think you have to say there isn't a human there. There's the form of a human, but it hasn't got the mind of a human.
Well, it doesn't have a developed mind uh, because of certain developmental reasons. If you don't develop up to a certain point, you're not going to develop. It's I mean, this might be a bad example, but a butterfly, if it doesn't position itself properly, hanging upside down, its wings are not going to fill out. And once, if if the wings don't fill out like they're supposed to, they're going to harden in whatever shape they are. And if they don't fully extend like they're supposed to, they're going to be all crumpled up and they're going to harden that way, and they're not going to ever fill out. It's the same way with the mind too. The mind of a child at a certain point, if it hasn't developed, it's not going to develop.
But that tells a lot about the nature of the self. Again, the Oriental philosophers have a word for this. They call it anatman. Atman is Sanskrit for the self. An is no. So it's no self. There isn't one. Now, I think that's strictly true. If I take my body alone and it never had any communication with other humans, I would not have a human self. I would develop whatever self was appropriate to the being that I had become within the community in which I had grown up, if I had the luck to have grown up at all. But that means, I think, that the self is a process rather than a thing. I state that in The Music of Life, long before writing Understanding Living Systems. So what Ray and I are stating there in Understanding Living Systems is a simpler explanation of the same point, because we don't need to put it in the form of an Oriental system of thought.
Yeah.
Even within our own system of philosophy, it doesn't make sense to ascribe a self to the brain alone. And there I lay my...
So, like I say, he's almost there, but he wants to say that it's a result of an evolutionary process. His self is a result of an evolutionary process. Well, how so? He can't explain it.
Case. That is my metaphysics
follow
in
you.
relation to the nature of the self.
Yeah, I can follow you. And that it is a process. It reminds me of what Alan Watts would say, that we shouldn't talk about a tree, but about treeing, the process of...
Indeed,
which is
the process of being a tree.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly so.
And
that knows a community because its roots do that.
what fascinates me, though, but this is like purely speculation, I'll ask you to speculate here, is if we see it all as a self-excited thing, the universe that sort of gets itself into this process, you write that it's that interface between order and chaos.
Yes, indeed.
And you write interesting things like nature creates problems. If there wouldn't be, well, how do you put it? If there wouldn't be life, there wouldn't be problems. So
This is where you get into mental gymnastics and trying to prove. It's the same thing if you got a box and you have introduce a gas into the box, all the gas molecules are going to spread out. And what I've actually heard a scientist, so-called scientist, or a teacher of some kind say, that if you wait long enough, you'll find that all the molecules of gas are in one corner. But in reality, that's never going to happen. It will never happen, well, because just the properties of gas, but even so, it's just not ever going to happen because their nature, the way they bounce against each other too. But But this is the point that they're getting to, is like just a mental gymnastics trying to prove the impossible.
So it is nature that creates this dichotomy, then starts playing with it, and somehow at this boundary, this
I
is just I
think
find this
I
utterly
think
fascinating.
absolutely. I think life lives on that boundary between order and chaos, between order and disorder. That's
Yeah.
the way I put it in a book called The Language of Symmetry.
Yeah.
There is a book, hasn't sold many copies because most people find it terribly difficult.
Yeah, order and disorder. Yeah, you got to get order from disorder is what the mental gymnastics has to say, has to claim, has to make that claim for a natural cause.
To understand.
We'll put it down in the descriptions for people they can. So I'll
It is
give it a
actually,
boost. Give
but
your
it exists. The Language of
Anyway, I'm
Symmetry
getting
is
a
a
little
book.
bit bored of
I'm
this
not the sole author. It was done with a philosopher called
thing.
Benedict Rattigan, and also a
Well,
popular.
if there's anything going on here, not a whole lot going on. What was it? The time of day? Oh, it's on 8 o'clock in the morning. 8:10, but that's about good enough for me. I gotta go probably do some things. It's getting late. So that's about it for me right now. I'll just take off and hope everybody has a great week this week, and follow the Lord, follow the Spirit of God, listen to the Spirit of God for your direction and purpose. Otherwise, you won't have any. Everybody, take care.